Michelle, the authorities have amended the regulations for level 4 and some people can now move. Can you just explain those changes?
So there have been two shifts, John. The first has been that tenants are, in terms of the new disaster management regulations that were published on the 29th of April, these gave effect to the fact that the old regulations were repealed and we had new regulations. In these new regulations, people were allowed to move back to their place of residence. They were allowed to travel between provinces, municipal areas or districts, back to their place of residence or their place of work between the 1st and the 7th of May. They were allowed to do this with private transport because they weren't in actual fact moving goods, their household goods, they were moving back to a place of existing residence. Now, as of the 7th of May, new directions were released which give effect to limited circumstances where tenants and homeowners can move or relocate in terms of new lease agreements or in terms of immovable property that was transferred. And where I say limited circumstances, it's limited to the fact where lease agreements, new lease agreements were entered into prior to or during lockdown, or where immovable property was transferred prior to lockdown. And it's important to understand what the definition of lockdown is. So the lockdown is defined in terms of the regulations, and this means that tenants can move if their lease agreement was entered into prior to or before the 26th of March to the 30th of April, or if the immovable property was transferred prior to the 26th of March.
So just to be clear, if they signed, the deals were signed and concluded, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
So who can't move? And looking forward to level 3, what can estate agents, landlords and tenants expect?
So anyone who's got an existing lease agreement where they don't have a new lease agreement to which they're moving into, and that lease agreement had to be concluded prior to or during the lockdown, or people whose property is now going to transfer now that the deeds office is open, and immovable property can transfer, because those transfers did not take place prior to the lockdown, they won't be able to move yet. But it's good news. The good news is that we're slowly seeing a relaxation of movement and the restrictions.
What happens when new or current tenants can't pay their rent due to lockdown and loss of their job or reduced income?
This is a frustrating question for many tenants. Many tenants are faced with a loss of earnings or limited earnings, either in part or in full. And so TPN has advocated the use of tenant income declaration documents, where tenants can declare what their circumstances are in terms of their loss of income. They must provide supporting documentation to prove the loss of income, and they must also allow the landlord to contact their employer to confirm the loss of income. In these circumstances where income has been lost, the tenant can then enter into a deposit utilization or a deferment agreement. And what this effectively means, the deposit utilization, both tenant and landlord must agree that the deposit can be used for the rent. The tenant further agrees that the deposit will be topped up over a period of time once the tenant is back in a position of earning income again. That provides immediate cash flow for the landlord. In terms of the deferment of rent agreement, again, because the tenant has lost their income, they could enter into an agreement that says, we're going to have our rent deferred for this period, but once we are back to in a position to earning again, we will reinstate or repay the deferred rent in installment repayments. This provides some relief for tenants in the short term, but what it does mean when they are back to earning again, they will be required to pay their rent in the ordinary course on a monthly basis, plus the catch-up of installments in terms of the deposit or the deferred rent.
Let's talk evictions. What are the do's and don'ts in the current scenario?
So during the lockdown, evictions were prohibited. Now, in terms of the new disaster management regulations that were released on the 29th of April, from the 1st of May, landlords can now apply to court to get an eviction order, and the courts may grant the eviction order. The restriction, though, is that the eviction order may not be executed on until the end of alert level 4, which means the tenant remains in the property and the sheriff will only be able to evict the tenant once we reach the end of alert level 4.
Is there any indication as to when end of level 4 will or not occur?
No indication at the moment as to when the end of alert level 4 will occur. And no indication yet what alert level 3, 2 or 1 even looks like.
Michelle, what happens now in terms of handovers and inspections for people that are coming in and leaving?
I think what we need to be aware of at the moment is some practical questions that landlords and tenants and estate agents may have in terms of these directions for relocation. Some of the questions that may be asked is, well, can the tenant and landlord do a joint incoming and outgoing inspection? What happens to the deposit in terms of the outgoing inspection for the tenant that's vacating the property at the moment? And the answer to that is that when the tenant is relocating, they need a permit to relocate. Permit will have to be signed by the station commander at the police station or his authorized delegate. In order to do that, the tenant must provide both the outgoing lease and the incoming lease agreement so that it can be determined to be within the parameters of these directions. When he's moving on transit, he can do so with a furniture removal company, and he must have both incoming and outgoing lease agreements, his identification, as well as the permit with him. When he arrives at his new premises, he's going to meet the landlord. They're going to hand over the keys at that point in time. At the point of handing over the keys, the landlord and tenant can then perform a joint incoming inspection, obviously maintaining social distance, wearing masks, only meeting with the signed delegate of the lease agreement and not the whole family, for example. The outgoing inspection, exactly the same thing. Where it's permitted, the landlord can come and collect the keys from the outgoing tenant and do the outgoing inspection at that point in time. Should, however, there be damages to the property will not be in a position to be restored at this stage. It'll only be able to be restored once maintenance people can come on site and perform the necessary maintenance or repairs. And at that point, the deposit may be released within 14 days after restoration of the property. Estate agents are not essential service workers, but in terms of the Rental Housing Act, a landlord is defined as the landlord or their duly authorized agent. So although estate agents will be able to perform the key handover and inspections for these very specific relocation purposes, they are not essential service workers in terms of the regulations.
In conclusion, Michelle, what else should landlords and tenants be aware of at the moment and thinking forward?
I think the most important thing here, John, is that we're seeing slow relaxation in the property market, and that's good news. It's important that we don't have mass movement all at the same time. And so what has happened is we've had slow and deliberate allocation to who may move.
That was Michelle Dickens, CEO of TPN Credit Bureau.
Business, finance and investment news. moneyweb.co.za. On the money.